And it was from the very first lecture, I thought, well, this just needs to be changed. We need to establish some sort of theoretical framework that fits, that can explain crime in the contextual changes that have occurred since the 1970s, especially deindustrialization and Thatcherite culture, which was entirely different to the culture in which I was brought up in a sort of a mining and steel town in the 1950s and 60s. A massive cultural change. And it wasn't taking consumerism, consumer culture, for instance. So from the word go, from the very first lecture, I just thought this just won't do. And I've been struggling against it ever since.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Ultra-Real Criminology, the 21st Century Criminology podcast. This week's episode is with Emeritus Professor Steve Hall, one of the founding fathers of ultra-realist criminology. Now, Anth and I had so much to talk about with Steve, and so we've actually decided to split this week's episode into two parts. Part 1 is going to focus on some of the intellectual foundations of ultra-realism, specifically looking at how ultra-realism thinks we can go about knowing the reality of crime and harm, and ultra-realism's understanding of the nature of the human subject and how human subjectivity comes into being, and the implications that this has for our understandings of crime and harm in contemporary society. And at the end of part 1, Ant and I are actually going to have a little debrief where we reflect on what Steve had to say and try and flesh out some of the implications of his ideas. Part 2 is going to focus more specifically on concepts and ideas generated by Steve, specifically the pseudo-pacification process and special liberty. Part 2 will be in a separate video, which is also available on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, we'll switch over to part 1 of our chat with Steve Hall. We hope you enjoy. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Ultra-Real Criminology, the 21st Century Criminology podcast. I'm Thomas Raymond, and I'm joined by my co-host Anthony Lloyd of Teesside University, who's joining us from Middlesbrough. Anth, how are you?
Good, thanks, Tom. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, not bad. So our first episode of the pod with Simon Winlow focused on the question, why ultra-realism? Why a new theoretical perspective or framework is needed to make sense of crime and harm in contemporary society. And we spoke about how ultra-realism emerged as a kind of response to the idealism that pervades criminology and the social sciences more generally. We spoke about the convergence of activism and academia and some of the problems that this raises, among other issues. And today's episode is going to dig into the intellectual foundations of ultra-realism in a little more detail and explore some key concepts and ideas that ultra-realism has produced. And so to help us with this, we're very glad to be joined by Professor Emeritus Steve Hall, who, along with Simon, who we spoke to last week, was instrumental in establishing ultra-realism as a kind of broad theoretical framework. And since the mid-90s, Steve has written dozens of books and journal articles, some links to which you can find in the notes below. And his significant work perhaps being, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Steve, Theorising Crime and Deviance, a New Perspective, which we'll talk a little bit about on this episode. So Steve, thanks for joining us. Thanks for taking the time, and welcome to the pod.
Great, well, thanks for having me.
Very welcome. Anth, I think you were going to kick us off, weren't you, today?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for joining us, Steve. To get us started, one of the things we're interested in on this podcast is our journey to criminological theory and our background and how we arrive at where we end up. And what I was want you to start off with is just give us a little bit of background. What was your journey into criminology? When you arrived at the discipline, what was your assessment of the discipline as you found it, and why you felt new theoretical perspectives were necessary?
Well, that's an interesting question. I suppose, you know, there's a lot I could say, but I'll try to keep it a very brief sort of potted history. I was the classic 1970s, early 1970s university dropout. When the fake hippie Timothy Leary said, "Tune in, turn on, drop out," I just did what I was told, you know. So I dropped out. I was actually a sort of jazzy blues guitar player, and I knew how to record charts, so I started getting quite a bit of weight. I tended to take a couple of years out of university. That turned into about 16 years, and I was sort of traveling around the place, you know, just a sort of journeyman musician. The bottom dropped out of my career when the synthesizer became popular in the 80s and work started to tail off. I bought a house and I needed to keep up the mortgage payments, so I thought, well, this isn't going too well, you know. I'm far too ugly to be a pop star, so I thought, well, you know, unless my work keeps up, I have to do something different. So I moved into what was then called, if I remember correctly, it was intensive intermediate treatment. It was called IIT, which was a means of trying to persuade young people, young boys mainly, between the ages of 14 and 17, how to stop getting trouble over very with activities that gave them very little reward anyway, and stop getting in trouble, get back to school and try and make something of their lives. And it was reasonably successful. There was a music connection there. One of the guys, young lads, bought him a drum kit with the Prince Charles Trust, and he ended up playing in Tel Aviv holiday resort. And I thought, well, that's not a bad result. That I wish I, you know, that was a sort of job for a young lad. That was wonderful. So I you know, worked with young offenders throughout the 1980s, and I became more sort of professional. I took a couple of qualifications. So I had a little bit of grounded experience in crime, and what struck me was the relationship between deindustrialization and the crime, and how criminal markets were becoming established in areas that previously had been where people were being catered for by sort of well-paid, reasonably well-paid, secure, unionized industrial work. And the local social services and we're sort of ignoring that aspect a little bit, probably because there was nothing they could do about it, because, you know, it was proving impossible to remove Mrs. Thatcher after the increased popularity after the Falklands War, etc. So I stuck with that, and became increasingly frustrated because the schemes that came about after that, alternative care and custody, became very individualized, psychologized. And it was obvious to me that crime, which was rocketing in the 1980s, don't forget, and this wasn't just a statistical phenomenon, this real crime was going up, especially volume crime, again, which is something criminology tends to ignore. There's a sort of everyday volume crime, drug distribution, and theft and all this sort of stuff. And it obviously needed policy intervention at a deeper level. So I decided to find out more about this. I thought, well, it was about 16 years now since I dropped out. You know, I better go back and see what's going on, you know, see if it's any better, and you know, because I didn't really enjoy it much first time around. So there I was, Northumbria, but the initial experiences were very disappointing, quite salutary, because it was the same stuff that was taught in 1972. You know, it was the same old nonsense. Which was fundamentally, I think, could be called a left liberal perspective. Now, I'm not knocking that perspective entirely. It has some things to teach us, and, you know, but it was so narrow. And I remember sitting down the first lecture, which was about moral panics. I thought, we're not still talking about this, are they? You know, and it was presented as if it was vital and new, and this was knowledge everyone should have, and this should be the basis of their explorations of crime and criminal justice and the context and everything. And I thought, well, if the basis of the study of crime is that crime isn't worth studying much, then it's not going to be very good, this, is it? You know, so I thought, well, what am I doing here again? And why am I sitting here? So as I became very friendly with one of the younger lecturers, Mike Randall. I've just come back from visiting him in Manchester. We stayed friends for life, you know, and he felt probably the same. He didn't really want to be teaching this stuff. And he dropped out to eventually become an economics teacher, working in a very posh grammar school. And we both felt the same, that really the knowledge production, theoretical frameworks had just not progressed at all. And they couldn't cope with the contexts that had been laid down in the 1980s and you know, which got worse in the 1990s when the crime rates in both the UK and the USA were reaching their peak in the early 1990s. And I remember, you two might not remember the Elsick riots of 1991, where everyone sitting in their houses terrified as half the time was a light. And all this was played down. I thought, well, is this just another moral panic? You know, why are we still grounding our whole discipline on such a flimsy concept that's a concept that can't distinguish between anxiety, fear, and panic, which are three entirely different things. It conflates these things, and simply is basically a critique of media, the way that the media portray crime for general consumption. So it was very, very disappointing. And it was from the very first lecture, I thought, well, this just needs to be changed. You know, we need to establish some sort of theoretical framework that fits, that can explain crime in the contextual changes that have occurred since the 1970s, especially deindustrialization and Thatcherite culture, which was entirely different to the culture in which I was brought up in a sort of a mining and steel town in the 1950s and 60s, a massive cultural change. And it wasn't taking consumerism, consumer culture, for instance. So from the word go, from the very first lecture, I just thought this just won't do. And I've been struggling against it ever since.
So, Steve, in the first episode with Simon, he briefly explored kind of what he described as ultra-realism's epistemological framework of how we can know reality. And he talks about the influence of critical realism there, you know, Bhaskara's gradients of reality, kind of moving from the empirical level of lived experience to the actual level of real events and processes, and then finally down to the real, the underlying generative mechanisms and structures and forces which kind of bear down upon the world and shape our lived reality and our behavior. So, but I realized that in that episode, we didn't necessarily give examples of those things. So just for clarity for our listeners who might not be familiar with critical realism and Bhaskara, can you just briefly give some examples of the empirical, the actual and the real as it's kind of, as you understand it?
Well, sure. I mean, the empirical in social science tends to work in two main dimensions, the qualitative and the quantitative. So an example of the quantitative empirical domain would be crime rates. A quantitative study has the advantage of being able to give us a sort of inkling of stuff that might be happening over a broad geographical space. For instance, the crime rates throughout England and various cities, urban areas, rural areas, etc. But what we're learning about crime, and because quantitative studies, as the students will know, ideas need to be operationalized and then quantified, and then the data needs to be analyzed and put into pretty little graphs and all the rest of it, is that it's quite facile on the ontological level. It doesn't really tell us much about what's going on. It just tells us how much of vagary is happening, you know. So if you want to quantify stuff, you're basically quantifying vagary. With qualitative empirical level, an example would be ethnographic studies of crime in a specific urban area, for example, has the opposite problem, of course, and that the knowledge, the ontological aspect of the knowledge we can glean is far more detailed and far more specific and far more enriching. But the problem is that you can't spread that out over a large area. So you can't talk about crime not only in a nation or a region, but you can't even talk about crime in a whole city. You're just talking about one little neighborhood and perhaps one section of one little neighborhood is all you might know about. So what ultra-realists did initially was attempt to establish ethnographic networks. Now that's to try to obviate that problem, overcome the problem of generalizability, which the research methods people might use these terms, generalizability. How can you generalize knowledge? Well, you only do that if you try to produce rich, detailed knowledge in more than one place. Yeah. So, in our studies, an example of that would be our studies of the riots in 2011, which was one of the first ultra-realist projects, which I thought worked quite well. So we had Dan Briggs in East London, we had James Treadwell in Birmingham, and we had various people across the Northeast looking at the way that the riots were both similar and different in the way that they occurred in those. They would compare the data, compare all the stories, the narratives, what people said, what they did, and we have generated a rich a body of knowledge which spanned. Now, it wasn't completely generalizable, it was only 3 areas. So what we would need to do, we thought, was to expand networks. We'd need to expand networks across the country. We need to establish ultra-realism abroad, perhaps in Europe. And we had some success in that in Spain, from the Europa University in Madrid, establishing networks, but it didn't go any further. So we have to say that we failed to establish those ethnographic networks. And I think one of the reasons why we failed was that there was such resistance in the discipline against ultra-realism, because ultra-realism was challenging some of the knowledge that was produced from standpoint positions, the standpoint positions that had emerged from the fragmentation of post-structuralism and postmodernism. These positions have become well established. They were very heavily defended. You felt you're going on the dam busters race sometimes when you tried to argue against a domain assumption from one of these positions. So huge resistance from that. Some of it was quite subtle, but other it was quite overt. So we didn't manage to establish those ethnographic networks. And I think that's, if ultra-realism wants to maintain some momentum, I think that's something that needs to be done over the next few years. Now that's empirical dimension. It's about experiential or knowledge or qualitatively generated knowledge at that level. The actual, according to Bhaskar, the actual events themselves. So again, using the riots as an example, it was the experience of the actual event of the riot, which was a sort of condensation of all of those factors that we've just been talking about, and how people experienced the riots, what they thought they were doing, and what others thought they were doing, and how other people experienced the actions of others. So all sorts of experiences that need to be analyzed in the context of that singular event. So basically, empirical, we're talking about experiences and data gathered from experience. The actual, we're talking about actual events and experiences. And then let's use the riots again, stick with that example to keep things clear. Bhaskar uses the term the real. Now, you don't confuse that with Lacan's real, capital R. This is small r real, this is Bhaskar's real. He talks about the generative contexts underneath the events and people's experiences of the events. So the generative context of those riots were 3 years after the great financial crash, austerity, job loss, the shift of deindustrialization produced a service economy, 0-hour contracts, insecure, the sort of stuff Anthony's been writing about very well for a number of years now, the sort of, let's call them what they are, crap jobs, which replaced the more stable, well remunerated and unionized industrial jobs. So it was a context of instability and insecurity. There was also a context of consumer culture, which had been pushed heavily by mass media from about 1960. Thomas Frank's rather wonderful book on the conquest of coolers, where it looked at that huge sea change in the advertising industry in 1960. and which people became, very much subjective consumers, which is something that the liberal left, again, is very, very reluctant to admit and use as part of the theoretical framework. One of the reasons why the liberal left theoretical framework is very weak and flimsy at the moment is that their refusal to accept these cultural currents and these cultural changes that have been going on for over 50, 60 years now. So the processes underneath this deindustrialization, austerity, all the big changes, the weak politics, depoliticization, remember Chantal Mouffe's post-political sort of meme that was going around. We don't have the politics that can cope with these big structural changes. We did after World War II with Keynesian economics and social democratic politics, intervention in the economy, all this nationalization of major industries and all the rest of it, which was moderately successful, relatively successful. But when very, very good criminologists, such as Robert Reiner, write about this, he's immediately attacked by post-structuralists and postmodernists who come in to say, well, yes, it was economically stable, but it was racist, it was sexist, it was homophobic, it was all things bad. We can't go back to that. Well, nobody's suggesting we go back to racism, sexism, homophobia. What we've got to go back to is a political intervention in the economy. So it's a failure to distinguish between these cultural and structural forces is the big problem. Bhaskar wanted to dig down and look again at these forces, but I don't think the critical realists made a great job of that, because I think an awful lot of the structural processes and forces are simply verboten. We can't talk about them. We don't want to talk about them. For instance, to be rather controversial, let's call it the investment and banking elite, for instance, who have huge concentrated power. Monsieur Foucault told us that concentrated power is irrelevant, and that power is everywhere, and it has this sort of capillary action, which the state watches everyone and surveils, learns how to influence people. Well, it may to some extent, but to stop looking at this concentrated power that lies at the center of the structural and processual change that Bhaskar calls the real, I think has been extremely negligent. So ultra-realism, again, perhaps, rather controversially, wanted to start looking at what C. Wright Mills called the power elite. And how long ago was that? I mean, we're looking in the 1950s. Yeah. So we were supposed to have progressed, but a lot of the ideas that were being mooted and explored to a certain extent, not very well, the 1950s have been kicked into the long grass. They've been thrown out. So we've lost more than we've gained. And so we have to, there are things we need to bring back, and the exploration of the power elite structures and processes. And I think the reason we stopped talking about them is that left liberalism had decided that there's nothing we can do about them without causing more damage, without becoming totalitarian.
So I'm going to circle back to that and the issue, specifically the issue of power and normativity and all of those things in a moment. But just to kind of keep on the thread, following on from that, what we didn't get a chance to talk about with Simon very much in any detail, and I think it's important in these first few episodes of the podcast just to give people a sense of kind of a holistic sense of ultra-realism and what it's all about. What we didn't get a chance to touch on in much detail was ultra-realism's kind of understanding of human subjectivity, of what we are as subjects, that ultra-realism borrows from transcendental materialism and theoretical psychoanalysis. And for me, this is so important, right? For any criminological theory, and it isn't necessarily reflected on enough. How we understand the nature of human subjectivity kind of shapes how we see and understand things like crime. So, for instance, rational choice theorists, they'll assume that the subject is kind of naturally egoistic and selfish and hedonistic and will do bad or harmful things if the rewards outweigh the negatives or the likelihood of getting caught. Other theories underpinned by a view of the subject as kind of essentially good, yeah, essentially kind of ethical and benign, but they're corrupted by social structures and norms and culture and so on and so forth. So could you explain kind of ultra-realism's understanding of human subjectivity and how it marries up with that kind of broad epistemological framework?
Of course, yeah. Just to reinforce what you've just said, Tom, if we stick with these domain assumptions, the dimension of subjectivity, the conservative notion of the fall, the evil, individual who needs constant guidance and discipline, or liberal enlightenment's reversal of that, this idea of the naturally good individual corrupted by the forces of oppression, and the dialectical subject, the subject who changes by understanding the contradictions. I think that's a weak position too, because some people just don't change. They don't take any notice of the contradictions, so we need to move away from all of that, because what we're going to get if we stick with these conceptions of subjectivity, these assumptions of what the human being actually is we're just going to get the same answers all of the time. We're not going to move ahead. We're not going to deepen our understanding of anything if we stick. So what is human subjectivity? This isn't set in stone, okay? I don't like it when people call us Lacanians or Zizekians, because we're not. We're simply, Simon Winlow and I, a lot of years surveyed and discussed in great detail what was available, what conceptions of subjectivity were available. And we sort of stick with what sounded more convincing to us. But what seemed to work for us was Lacan's tripartite notion of the subject. The idea of as I bring the real back, and this is the real with a capital R, which has nothing to do with Basker's real. It's rather confusing, which is simply a human being initially as a confused subject of conflicting drives and conflicting desires and conflicting emotional stimuli. A human being that is at its root quite flexible, but at the same time quite anxious. And that led us to reconceptualize anxiety and fear and panic, which criminologists such as Stanley Cohen have very weak ideas around these entirely different concepts. Anxiety is the feeling that there's something happening, but you don't know what it is. There's something threatening, there's something wrong, but you don't have no idea what it is. It's just this constant nagging feeling of something out there being wrong, not quite right. Fear is objectified anxiety. So fear is when you suddenly say, it's a lion. That's what I should be fearing. Now, fear is quite healthy compared to anxiety, because all of a sudden you know what you should be frightened of. You know what's threatening you, and therefore you have to do something about it. Problem with fear is that it can be ideologically manipulated. People can tell you that this is the object of your fear, this is what's causing you anxiety, when it's not. It's something different. So that's problematic too. Panic is when you reach the stage of thinking, well, you know what your object of fear is, even though it might be completely wrong, but there's nothing you can do about it. So you fly into a panic. So these things are completely different. I'm simplifying that, but but hopefully it's so that people can understand it. It's a lot more complicated than that, but basically that's what it's about. So the journey from the real, the journey from this, what we called objectless anxiety. We called it objectless anxiety, and people said, well, all anxiety is objectless. They said, well, we know that, but if you sustain the objectlessness, or if you muddy the waters regarding what the object is, then it remains. So basically, objectless anxiety is ideologically sustained objectlessness. You see what I mean? That's the difference between so you move from this state of anxiety into an objectified. The problem is that you move into what Lacan called the imaginary. And this is where ideology can operate, by putting all sorts of things in your head. What's causing distress? It's immigrants. It's this, that, you can just basically be misled ideologically in the imaginary realm. So then we move through the imaginary, because some of us, believe it or not, actually want to know what's really going on. You know, we move through the imaginary, and I suppose what drives that is curiosity, more than anything else. Not necessarily politics. It might be a sense of justice, wanting to put things right, wanting to know it's really, well, before we can put anything right, we want to know what we have to get our hands on. Yeah, it might be politics. It might be just sheer curiosity. I'm sure with me it was a bit of both. Born in a steel town, you know, well, it was actually a tiny little mining village on the outskirts of a steel town. A sense of injustice, especially after the steelworks closure and all that. Also, the sense of curiosity, because at school I'd been very keen on science and philosophy. So both operating as curiosity. So you move into what Lacan called a symbolic order, an order of symbols. Now, these symbols aren't real, but some of them are still connected to the imaginary, and some of them are the products of attempts to construct symbols that bear some sort of relationship to reality. Let's not overstate ultra-realism's potential. You can't put you can't put reality inside your head. But what you can do is try to be honest with, it's about honesty and integrity. It's about trying to construct symbols that represent reality, external reality, and our experiences of external reality. Remember, going back to Bhaskara's actual events, with some sort of honesty and integrity. That does not necessarily come from the people who experience the events themselves. Now, Simon Winlow's doing a lot of work on memory. You might be familiar with on this. Memory kicks in after events. It doesn't kick in during the event. Memory isn't a pure and clear, unadulterated recording of events. Memory kicks in after. Memory is susceptible to bias and prejudice as much as anything else is. So you need a third party. Now, if you look at the old-fashioned criminologists didn't get everything wrong. They always says, for instance, early studies of violence said, victim, perpetrator, and a third party. Now, the third party is supposed to be the social scientist, yeah? A little bit like a judge in a court who could weigh up the evidence from the prosecution and start to create some sort of, or a jury in straight to create, construct some sort of clearer picture. Ultra-realism doesn't claim to be a clear, pure representation of reality. Anyone who claims that is a fraud. What it does claim is to have more honesty and integrity, and to try to construct an unbiased third-party position that can weigh up the evidence and also understand the contexts in which the evidence exists with a little more clarity, enough clarity to give us an idea of how we can intervene politically in those contexts, and also in terms of social policy to try to help people who are experiencing the events. We don't dismiss social policy. We don't, for instance, dismiss better responses to domestic violence, etc. That's all very important in that actual realm, but we won't be able to do that until we have a clear understanding of the events in their context and what we can do about it at those two levels. So ultra-realism is in some ways a return to what was traditional social science, but with a far better and clearer understanding of the human subject. So in the human subject enters the symbolic order, what we would say is the human subject morally deserves a better symbolic order. The problem is that with the current neoliberal order in which we live, and neoliberalism isn't the only ideology that misleads, ever misled anyone. Don't get me wrong about that. Its job is to keep subjects trapped within the imaginary realm. So when subjects try to exercise their curiosity, and they want to know, this tends to produce conspiracy theories, because the symbolic order is so dishonest. There's so much lying, so much covering up going on. And social science, sometimes, I have to say, is aids and abets that covering up. And it has to stop doing that. But we have to adopt an honest social science, free and open debate. This is what universities are supposed to be for, isn't it?
Yeah,
and we have to.
This is the realism in ultra-realism, moving away from any kind of idealistic notion of the subject or of a particular symbolic order or political philosophy or what have you.
That's right. It's a I think that Simon Winlow, I know, was very keen on using the phrase "begin from the beginning," and it is we need to wipe the ideological slate clean. So yes, we need a more honest symbolic order. Ultra-realism is an initial attempt in one little discipline, criminology, to try to begin the reconstruction of a more honest symbolic order, set of symbols that can represent reality with more clarity.
I think one of my favorite pieces of work of yours is quite dense in places, but I'd recommend anyone go to read it, is the article that you did. I forget which journal it was in, but the solicitation of the trap.
Oh yes.
And the abiding kind of idea that I got from that, and it's always really stuck for me, is that if we think about this subject, who is born into, as you say, the Lacanian real, this kind of raw, unsymbolizable set of drives and internal bodily forces, we don't know what these things mean. We've got no reference point for, you feel hungry in your belly. Well, I don't know what that means. So the subject, this raw subject of lack and anxiety, the thing that I took from that article was that they need a set of coherent symbols in order to make sense of the world around them. They require it, and so that actually the subject will always actively solicit a symbolic order to make sense of their world. And so then that taps into some of the problems that you talk about with ideology, with symbolic orders that kind of, like consumer culture, for instance, that's got one foot in the imaginary realm and one foot in the symbolic, and it doesn't offer a kind of stable basis for the subject to kind of come into being, as it were. And I've always found that a really powerful idea, and also one that seems to cut against political and intellectual work that views the answer to everything as, well, let's just liberate the subject from structures, let's liberate the subject from culture, from norms, from all of these things.
Which is exactly what the subject doesn't want, because that can propel the subject back into the real, and as this confused individual, unable to get any guidance about how to explain all of these drives and stimuli that there's not just confusing the subject, but trying to spur the subject into action in the various ways. The problem with most symbolic orders, all symbolic orders in history, is that they keep one foot trapped in the imaginary. I mean, the symbolic order we supplied with for 2,000 years has been Judeo-Christianity, or I know some Jewish people object to that term. It's Christianity, really, but the Bible does contain both the Old and New Testament. So, and 1 foot in reality, half a foot in reality, and 1.5 feet in the imaginary still, I think. It really didn't help us to cope, because it gave us moral guidance, some of which was overly repressive and some of which was very useful. Thou shalt not kill is a very good idea, I think, they were all negative. They were all prohibitions, weren't they? There was nothing particularly positive. Some of the stuff in the New Testament was very positive: go out and do good and treat other people as you would treat yourselves. A few positive ideas, but on a bed of negative prohibitions. Thou shalt not do this. But they were quite useful guidance. But in order to retain some sort of human connection to this moral guidance, it was an awful lot of parables and fairy stories. It was very much trapped in the imaginary. the Enlightenment was supposed to be a movement out of the imaginary into scientific rationalism. It gave us methods that worked to some extent, positivism, for instance, but weren't particularly successful. So again, ultra-realism is trying to give people the chance to construct, both philosophically and scientifically, a more realistic symbolic order, that can move us into the future. Just what is exactly going on? Why did the economy tank in 2008? Why was austerity forced upon us? Why did we deindustrialize? We need to answer these questions, and we need to connect these big processes with human subjectivity. How did people respond to this? Were they giving clear ideas about why this was going on, about the possible consequences of this structural change? No, it was all positive, wasn't it? It was all, oh, we're forging ahead into the future, follow us, everything's going to be great. The service economy will compensate for the loss of the industrial jobs. The speculators are going to make us rich. Their taxes pay for all our schools. We know that from the modern monetary theory. It's all complete rubbish. It's nonsense. It's hokum. So we haven't, let me say this quite categorically, we've never experienced a symbolic order that has been honest and has tried to move us out of the imaginary into a world in which we have a firm grasp of the reality in which we're forced to live every day. And of course, we solicit the trap. We can't live without that symbolic order. I mean, it's madness. I mean that literally. I mean, the real is madness. I mean, we're just, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing all sorts of quite crazy discourses appear. Am I allowed to say that some of them are coming from over the pond, from America, some of these crazy ideas, and, and what is it when a reasonably well-educated actor such as Tom Cruise, or a very, very clever musician such as Chick Corea joins the Scientology movement? What sort of world are we living in? A world of idiot savants, a world of people who are very clever at some things, but when it comes to their politics and philosophy, they've been so misled that there's nothing firm to get hold of. And that move into madness is regarded by neoliberals as healthier than a move into a more clear and honest symbolic order. Now, I don't see how human beings can cope with this without basically going a bit crazy. And we see the mental health. I mean, people like Anthony, I mean, you might know more about this, about mental health figures and stress at work and also all of this. When you're trapped in an imaginary, you're trapped in a fairy story. You're through the looking glass. Oh, well, and you start believing your imagination is real.
Okay, so we hope you enjoyed part one of our chat with Steve Hall there. Part two is going to be in a separate video, which you can also find on our YouTube channel. But before we finish part one, Anthony and I both thought that it was worth having a kind of debrief on that first part of our chat with Steve. There was a lot to unpack from what Steve had to say, a lot of kind of abstract thought and ideas that we feel it's worth reflecting on and chatting about a little bit further, just to kind of fully tease out some of the concrete implications that this has for thinking about crime, harm, and criminology more generally, and what we can learn from it. So, Ant, what were some of the things that stood out for you that you kind of want us to dig into a little bit more?
Well, there was quite a lot across the whole conversation, and I think kind of trying to take it chronologically, certainly dealing with this first part part one of the conversation. Steve set out the domains of reality for critical realism and he used the 2011 riots to talk about the actual, the empirical and the real. And I think it's a useful example to allow us to get into conversation about consumer culture.
Yeah.
And thinking particularly about the way within which criminology and social science more generally would approach something like the 2011 riots. And when we look at those sort of domains of reality, what struck me was thinking about the context of the riots, those, if you like, the depth structures or those sort of generative mechanisms in the domain of the real that I don't know that kind of get a proper airing when we look at something like the 2011 riots. So for me, the thinking about, Steve talked about the 2008 financial crisis, and he talked about the implementation of austerity in 2010 as being part of that. But I think there's also, and he didn't really touch on it, but it's kind of central to the argument that Steve and Simon and James Treadwell and Dan Briggs made in their British Journal of Criminology paper, and also the Riots and Political Protest book 2015, was consumer culture as being part of that sort of depth structure and the generative mechanisms. And I think it's worth just teasing out some of the points about consumer culture. And I know you've written a little bit about, particularly in relation to deviant leisure and the impact of consumer culture on subjectivity, and the way within which the subject solicits, if you like, the symbolic order of contemporary consumer capitalism. So I guess kind of over to you a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's always one of the things that when I've read their work, one of the earliest bits that I took, I think it was in Criminal Identities and Consumer Culture, was their idea that criminal actors are often hyperconformists in values rather than norms. They are absolutely hyperconformist to the values of liberal capitalism and consumer culture. And so absolutely that kind of underpinned, and it kind of goes back as well to the first episode when you're talking about the riots, and you got lots of papers on the riots around that time that positioned it all as, well, this is resistance, this is the people fighting back against, you know, oppression and you know, frustration and marginalization and exclusion and you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this kind of, yeah, borderline kind of idealistic, romantic view of the riots, rather than viewing them. And if you know, go and read the data that they collected of what it was for a lot of people, particularly as the riots spread out from the initial protest around the killing of Mark Duggan, but then as the riots spread across the country to Manchester and Birmingham, Liverpool and everywhere, the fact that they became, in many respects, consumer riots, and it was people, you know, absolutely conforming to those dominant values and ideals around consumer culture. And I think, you know, you can make that argument as well around a lot of criminal activity and entrepreneurial criminal activity. And so, yeah, like you say, that kind of solicitation of that symbolic order of consumer capitalism that's kind of got one foot in the imaginary and kind of half a foot in the symbolic is, for me, quite a powerful idea that this is actively solicited in order to help the subject make coherent sense of themselves, of their place in the world, of their value, and that this is constructed around those kind of consumerist symbols. The other thing about it, which we didn't talk about at all on the episode, was this idea in consumerism, and it's something that ultra-realism talks about a lot, was this idea around lack, and that lack is at the core of subjectivity, that we are constantly looking for a set of symbols to make coherent sense of ourselves, but that it's a lack that can never be fully filled in, fully addressed. So like in Lacanian terms, it would be called the lost object of desire, that our desire revolves around an object that doesn't exist. Yeah, this idea that we can, once we have this thing, we will feel complete. Once we have this commodity or this job or this relationship or whatever, we will feel complete, we'll feel satisfied, we'll have enjoyment. But it's always elusive, it's always out of our grasp. And so it's this idea around that consumerism is actually about dissatisfaction rather than satisfaction. Consumerism presents itself as about satisfying our needs and desires, but actually it's about cultivating dissatisfaction, about lack. And at the moment you kind of acquire the object of your desires, whether it's the nice car or the new wardrobe or whatever it might be, the thing itself that you desire starts to lose its allure. And actually we enjoy those things most when they're prohibited to us, when they're out of our reach, because they still retain that promise of being the thing that will complete us, that will fill us up, that will fill in that lack. And then we acquire it and we go, oh, it's not the lost object. And so we direct our attention to something else. But it's not the lost object because that lost object doesn't exist, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. It's I guess the sort of fundamental truth about consumerism is that the novelty wears off once you acquire the object. It just becomes part of your everyday. It's just something that you own, that you use, and the allure, as you described, has already moved on to the next thing. And I guess that's one of the power of consumer capitalism in that sense, that there's an endless array of commodities and experiences and desires that serve that purpose, that draw us in, become what we think is the object that will satisfy us, and then it jumps and it jumps and it jumps and it jumps. And it's always that satisfaction's always out of reach. And I think you're right in terms of, it's a point Todd McGowan makes, isn't it, about the cultivation of dissatisfaction. And I was just thinking about the point you made, the first point you made in relation to conformity and hyperconformity around consumer culture. And that's something that really came out in research that I was involved in on the pandemic. The first paper we wrote on the pandemic was using data that Dan Briggs had collected from a global survey. And it was people's experiences of the first lockdown. And what came through really strongly was, even though this was certainly in media terms and commentary, was this lockdown, the pandemic was potentially the thing that was going to force a reckoning with the way we live our lives. And and this was the opportunity, that potentially an event in a Bedouin sense to shift to something. Things were never going to be the same, and we could use this as the moment to move beyond the lifestyles that we live today. And the data was very, very clear about what did people miss. And it was shopping, it was McDonald's, it was it was all of those things. And it actually reinforces the second point that you made about something is never more attractive than when it's prohibited. So it's very clear that the strength of our attachment to the symbolic order of consumer culture was too strong, even for something as pivotal and fundamental as a global pandemic and the lockdowns that we were kind of put into. So
people enjoyed the pandemic, I think.
Yeah.
In a certain way, in a weird, perverse way. Now people will probably go, well, easy for you to say because you weren't working, out on the front line, kind of working all the way through it, working in the NHS, and all of those kind of things, or you weren't stuck in a tiny little flat, with kids running around driving you nuts and all the rest of it. And that's absolutely true. But I think, just to make a wide kind of observation, I think people enjoyed aspects of that lockdown in a way And that's probably worth digging into maybe in future episodes on the pod. Maybe we could do an episode on the pandemic at some point. But just to come back to consumerism, I think what's really interesting about consumerism as well is that we repeat this interminable pattern over and over and over again, even when we're aware of it. Yeah, like no one's immune. Like, you know, we talk critically about consumerism, consumer culture. Yeah, I am just as much of a, well, maybe not just as much as, but I am a consumerist like anyone else. You know, you still have that same logic that plays out. And even though I'm aware of it, it's very difficult to resist. And I think that's where it's tied to the very nature of subjectivity and desire. And these are kind of powerful forces that you can't necessarily just rationalize your way out of necessarily. And so that it takes us on to a point and another concept that we didn't get a chance to discuss with Steve, that links back to, you know, we were talking about how subjects actively solicit the symbolic order, or the illusory images of the imaginary in order to avoid a kind of traumatic encounter with the Lacanian real, that raw, unsymbolizable set of stimuli and experiences. And it ties into a couple of things around how ideology functions, I think. And, you know, so a lot of models of ideology rooted in this idea that ideology functions by misleading subjects, and that if we just show people, you know, that this is all false, that it's not real, that it's not true, that you're being misguided or misled, then all of a sudden, you know, yes. And once we're shown that consumerism is this, you know, awful thing, that people will go, aha, you know, I won't do that anymore. Once we've shown that capitalism's horribly unequal and has all of these bad, nefarious aspects to it, right, we'll come up and we'll resist, and socialism will reign. And Zizek's idea around this is that he talks about the reversal of ideology, doesn't he? That ideology operates at the level of action rather than thought. And so, you know, you can think and you can say whatever you like. You know, you can say that consumerism's terrible so long as you continue to shop. Yeah. And so we know all of these things about capitalism, about consumerism, about climate change, but we act as if we don't know. And this is how ideology functions. And so it comes into that idea around fetishistic disavowal that Zizek likes to use, and that ultra-realists have used quite a lot. That idea of, you know, we know, but we don't want to know. Therefore, we act as if we don't know. And this is how, like, big social harms like climate change continue to get perpetuated, don't they? You know, we know about the harms of climate change, yet we'll continue to jet off on our holidays, or we'll know that fast fashion labels have horrendous employment practices that we would rather not be the case, yet we continue to shop at Primark and things of this nature.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I teach fetishistic disavowal to some of our students, and I use kind of climate change, environmental harm as the example, and it's hard to not come across as a little bit kind of not necessarily preachy, but as if you're kind of having a go at the students, and you can kind of see that. But, you know, I'm saying, you know these things, but you act as if you don't, and that's, you know, we all do that.
That's the key, is that we all do that.
We all do that.
This is how it functions. Yeah.
You know, we're sitting here, and, you know, we're in the middle of a heat wave that, you know, the government have declared a national emergency because can't cope with, you know, these record temperatures. I've just come back from 5 days in Italy, you know, so I can't sit here and say, you know, I'm kind of holier than thou.
Earth murderer.
Exactly. Yeah, you know, it's we're not exempt from this. We can think critically about it, but yeah, this idea of, you know, ideology acts as a veil of false consciousness, as Marx said. If the veil falls and we see reality, then we'll act differently. And I think there's some real value in thinking about fetishistic disavowal, and I think it works in a number of different situations. And I think what ultra-realism tries to do is not just use it, but try to develop it as well. And I know Justin Kotzer has done some work with fetishistic disavowal in the sense of what he calls degrees of assimilation.
Right.
So rather than it simply acting as in the same way with everybody, we all disavow to the same degree. Justin has tried to find levels of assimilation, and he returns to that idea of the Lacanian real. So depending on your proximity to the real, or the level to which you've invested in the what he calls the dream myth, the symbolic order of, if you like, liberal capitalism, your degree of disavowal will be greater or lesser as a result.
Right.
So if we use climate change as the example, if you live somewhere where the effects of climate change are not particularly prevalent, where you're not living in drought or paradoxically flooded, like areas that flood, or you're not in the middle of a heat wave, then your proximity to the real is you're quite far removed from that. So it's easier to disavow it. If you're living in one of these places along the M25 that's currently on fire, then your proximity to the real of climate change it's hard to deny that. It's hard to act as if you don't know these things because you're trying to stop your house burning down.
Yeah.
So it's, I think it's a useful way of thinking about and developing that idea of disavowal.
And I guess the validity of that, and this is where you kind of come up with these ideas and then you test the validity of them, don't you? And the validity of that idea that Justin's come up with, that's new to me. I haven't read his work on that yet. Will be tested by, well, let's see what the response is to all of this in the coming months and years, because that was my thinking yesterday, was that this has surely got to force some kind of real significant action when your own citizens' houses start burning down. Then that's when you can no longer disavow. You can't engage in this kind of knowing but not knowing, or knowing but acting as if you don't know, because it becomes too real. So there's, I think, we'll find out the validity of that as it comes through. But the challenge in being able to do that is the subjects will not abandon the harmful symbolic order that we have now unless there is an alternative to solicit that is appealing to the subject and that can give them a sense of security and meaning and purpose. And this is where kind of Mark Fisher's ideas around capitalist realism come in that, we've got in the last kind of 50 odd years, 45, 50 years, there's been as the famous slogan was, there's been no alternative. There's been no alternative symbolic order that's made it into mainstream consciousness for people to actively identify with in order to abandon that symbolic order. And the subject won't abandon that symbolic order because of that fear of the return of the real. And so, you get this kind of constant avoidance there. Yeah, no,
I think that's true, and this does speak to a point that Steve made about the subject always needs to solicit a symbolic order, and without that alternative, then all of us will cling on to the symbolic order that allows us to make sense of the world we're in, however imperfectly it works and functions. And that leads us into the realm of politics, which brings us back to the previous conversation with Simon, doesn't it? Without an alternative political vision or without an alternative symbolic order, we will, what are the chances of us dealing with some of these big issues? Steve talked about concentrated power as largely being ignored by by criminology. If there's nothing we can do about some of these issues around political economy, then that absolutely speaks to that idea of a post-political era. And I know the end of history book, Alex Herkley and George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe's book talks about the shift away from post-politics but towards an anti-politics, where people are no longer apathetic, they're angry. But what are they angry with? They're angry with the failings of the current political system, but there's still no alternative. Nobody's offering a coherent alternative to what we've currently got. Again, to come back to the risk of turning this into the future pod on the pandemic, there was talk that the pandemic showed us a different way forward, but where are we now? Kind of 2 years after the start of COVID, we're talking about tax cuts and austerity. We're back in that kind of neoliberal framework again, aren't we? So that alternative doesn't exist. We're still within the realm of capitalist realism.
Yeah, and I guess one last point that I'd be keen to make, and it's something I've thought about for a while, is that I think a lot of criminology and semiology, the study of social harm, a lot of it is rooted in a kind of anti-politics. You've got anti-corruption being something. I'm doing work on corruption at the moment, and you've got anti-corruption, you've got anti-fascism, you've got various anti-austerity, you've got various anti-policies. And the thing about anti-policies is that they're rooted in the idea of a kind of perfect enjoyment and ultimate satisfaction that will arrive in the future once we've gotten rid of the thing that we are anti.
Yeah.
So, it will all be all right and harmonious and brilliant once we've gotten rid of neoliberalism, or once we've gotten rid of fascism, or once we've finally eliminated corruption, or whatever it might be. The problem with that, and it comes back to the point made earlier around desire, is that the enjoyment that is promised is never quite forthcoming. And so you can only enjoy that utopian vision, that future, for as long as it's prohibited, for as long as you haven't realized it yet, the elimination of that thing you're anti. And so, and it's perhaps a contentious thing to say, but it's a point worth people can stew on it. The point that I would make is that in a lot of anti-politics, I would argue that there's often a kind of unconscious libidinal attachment to the very thing that they're anti.
Yeah.
There was an interesting, I was listening to an anti-corruption podcast the other day, and there was this prominent investigative journalist who does really amazing work, revealing he was involved, I think, in the Swiss secrets leaks around Credit Suisse and all of the corruption that they've been involved with in terms of money laundering for transnational organized crime figures. I think he was involved in the Panama Papers leak as well. And he said, it's an interesting point, he said he was addicted to these kind of revelations and leaks, which I thought was a really interesting thing to say. Almost like each time a new leak comes around, there's almost like like a relief. Yeah. Almost like, oh, all right, thank God, there's still something to latch onto. And perhaps that's got something to do with as well the kind of expansion of the terms like fascism, for instance. It's this kind of ballooning thing that gets used in this kind of blanket way. And I think within criminology and semiology, there's a lot of politics that's rooted around this anti-politics, where there's this attachment to things that people are anti.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think this is where the tools of theoretical psychoanalysis are helpful. And I know it's not a popular way of looking at some of these issues, but if we do consider the structure of desire, then the satisfaction is in the journey and not the destination, because the destination is never achievable. So if you withhold, or you believe satisfaction will be arrived at through the elimination of corruption and not through the journey to eliminate corruption, then you will never arrive at your end point. You're never going to arrive at that stage. It's unobtainable. And what would you do if you did? You jump from that would be, the object of desire would move on to the next thing.
Well, I think especially as identity, professional identity, personal identity gets so wrapped up with all of these things as well. People's friendship groups, their social lives are often wrapped up within activism and things of this nature, which isn't a bad thing necessarily. No. But there is that kind of thing of, once you actually resolve the issue that you're fighting against, it's kind of like, what am I going to do now? So I think it's something worth stewing on. But I think we've probably talked long enough. There's plenty more. Oh, God, we could talk for hours about this stuff, couldn't we? But we've got to stop somewhere to give the listeners a break. So that was part one of our episode and our chat with Steve and our little post kind of debrief there. Switch over to part two of our episode with Steve, where we dig in much more into specific concepts and ideas that he's used to try and theorize and explain crime and harm and the motivations for crime and harm. So we hope you enjoyed part one, and we hope that you switch over to part two. As always, hit the like and subscribe button, and we will see you next time.